I'm Marie Walsh, and this is my adaptation of Eliza Haywood's Fantomina. I suppose I could start from the night I happened to be in a box at the playhouse when I first met Beauplaisir. Some may have thought that I came for no other purpose than to create acquaintance with as many men as seemed desirous of, and this may have been true, but on that night in particular, I renewed an acquaintance that excited my curiosity. I spotted him from across the playhouse as he rushed through the crowd and made his way onto the bench where I sat. We spoke, and he professed his passions for me, and later he told me I must either follow him to a house of his procuring, or permit him to attend me to my house. Sometimes I wanted to admit my real quality to him, but some ill stars within me prevented it. An excuse came to my head, and I bought myself another night by giving him a solemn promise to be in the same booth the following night to meet him. I acquired a lodging about a mile away from the playhouse, should he insist on passing some part of the night with me, and as expected we returned to the lodging the following night. We spoke over supper, and continued on with the night. He became bold and resolute, and I grew fearful and confused, and altogether unprepared to handle such encounters, rendered by the extreme liking I had to him. I tried to engage him, but no words were sufficient to curb the burning eagerness of his desires, and in fine he gained victory. We parted towards the morning, planning to revisit later in the afternoon. I made arrangements with the woman of the house to tell anything to Beauplaisir to ensure his knowledge that I stayed there. Beauplaisir and I met several times after we parted, but my rifled charms as Fantomina soon lost their poignancy and became tasteless and insipid. It was plain to me that he desired to leave me for no other purpose than for growing tired of my conversation. But I realized that I loved him, and made it my design to engage him once more. No sooner had I heard that he left town to go to Bath, and I quickly made my way towards him. When I arrived in Bath, I spoke with a broad country dialect, with a rude and unpolished air. I disguised myself in such a way that would leave me unrecognizable. I blackened my hair and my eyebrows, and I wore an outfit that would make it impossible for me to be recognized. I made it my business to find out where Mr. Beauplaisir stayed, and when I did, I spoke with the mistress of the house, and she gladly took me in as maid, as Celia. When I finally became acquainted with Beauplaisir as Celia, he was enamored. He lost his power to control himself. His burning desires burst through in all of his words and actions. He devoured my lips and breast with greedy kisses, till he had ravaged all. I continued a romance with Beauplaisir during his stay in Bath that lasted no longer than 1 month. But by the end of his stay in Bath, he had grown more weary of Celia than he had of Fantomina. So I quit my lodging at the residence, but I remained in town until I got word that he returned back home. And this time I developed my third disguise, the plot of a sorrowful widow. I hired a man and his horses to attend me about 10 miles outside of Bath, and I discharged them, and waited for his chariot to come by, and when it did, I called for it to stop, and approached it, and he was alone in his chariot, and I said, "Distressed and wretched sir, never fail to excite compassion inside a generous mind, and I hope I'm not deceived in my opinion that yours is such. You have You have the appearance of a gentleman who, upon hearing my story, cannot refuse the help that is in your power of an unhappy woman, who without it would be rendered the most miserable of all created beings. He told me I may command anything in his power. I explained to him that I'd recently lost everything that would be considered valuable to a woman, including my husband. I explained to him that I needed to get to London, but I'd been recently injured and couldn't get there on horseback. He told me it would be impossible to deny a place in his carriage to a woman like myself. We spoke, and he showered me with compliments. But I responded but with tears. I was so in tune with my emotions as a widow. I had tears flowing from my eyes. I couldn't keep the handkerchief away from my face for one moment. He said 1,000 handsome things to persuade me from such grief, but perhaps I was too convincing. He seemed to lose interest in my emotions as a widow. Perhaps he thought it dull that I was so devoted to the memory of my dead husband. He redirected the conversation and we carried on, and I led him to feel grateful for having this opportunity with me. We went to the inn where we were to stay for the night. He didn't profess his passions for me as he had done with Fantomina and Celia, but he gave 1,000 softening artifices, which led me to believe he was enamored with me. He kissed away my tears, and he offered to exchange passions with me. He said he would forever bear my load of sorrows. His passions advanced, but I felt it wouldn't be appropriate to give in so soon, with my state, despite my inclinations. So I counterfeited a fainting, and Eliza picked me up and laid me on the bed, and he lay down next to me. Now, some may think that it was impossible to manage to fool him again during our time of intimacy, but I assure you that I knew how to disguise myself in such a way that I merely seemed familiar to Beauplaisir. He was unable to. He might have reminded him of someone who he couldn't put his finger on. We continued the rest of our journey in happiness, and we parted under the mutual agreement of seeing each other often. I wrote to Beauplaisir as Fantomina and the widow, and he responded to both. To the widow he said that he had been lonely ever since we'd parted, and he felt like a body without a soul. And to Fantomina he explained that it would be an impossibility to be disloyal, and that he merely forgot the name of the woman whose house I was staying, so it was impossible for him to address the letter. I was deceived and cheated. I met with him a couple times as Fantomina and the widow, but it became clear that he'd grown weary of them, so I developed another plot to deceive him as easily as he'd deceived me. I proceeded on to the park where I recruited 2 gentlemen to help me in my latest endeavor. They were at first confused, but I assured them that they were in no danger by assisting me, and that all I required from them was their secrecy. I also offered them a handsome sum of money, so they agreed. I instructed them to dress as servants and to deliver a letter to Beauplaisir and bring back his response. I explained to them that they must be careful in their replies to him and make it appear that their secrecy was for no other purpose than out of integrity of their trust. When Beauplaisir received his letter, he had several questions directly opposite to the director of the letter, but silence would have availed him as much as all of his testimonies of curiosity. He responded to my letter with a letter of his own. He informed me that I need not doubt his glad compliance with my obliging summons, and he signed it off as my everlasting slave. The hour drew near when he was to arrive, and I dressed in a magnificent manner, as if I were to go to a ball, and Beauplaisir was prodigiously charmed with my appearance. but I kept my face covered, and he began to sue for the performance of my promise of granting everything that he could ask for, except for the knowledge of my name and the sight of my face. And I told him that if he was not satisfied with what I was willing to reveal, then I would rather leave him forever than gratify his inquisitiveness, which has no business with love. Before he left the house, he turned the discourse into expressing his violent passions for me. He swore he could dwell in my arms forever, and he pressed me to permit him to tarry with me the whole night. And I granted his request, for it would not be in my nature to refuse such an offer. When the hour of repose arrived, he asked me to go to him to the chambers, and I agreed, however, obliging him to go first. I came to the chambers when it was completely dark, so he couldn't see me, and he embraced me with the utmost impatience for the following morning, when he would see me uncovered. However, when the morning arrived, he was in great disappointment, for I had taken special precautions to have the windows completely covered so that no light shone in. When he saw this, he complained to me about my behavior, and he had no scruple in expressing his sense of the little trust I reposed in him. He left the house and swore never to return again. I continued to write to him as Fantomina and Celia, but his behavior towards both grew so cold that I dropped the two characters. And right after I had received sudden news that my mother had returned to town, she had been out of the country for a while. So I knew I'd have to end my endeavors, but the concealment of my adventures would not be the hardest thing to conceal. I was with child. However, by eating little and wearing a specially designed hoop petticoat, I thought I could conceal my condition for some time until I would be sent to the country as planned. Then I went to a ball with my mother and was stricken with some sort of shock of nature, and I had to get wheeled home in a wheelchair. A physician was called for, and when he arrived, he pulled my mother aside and informed her of my state. She'd never been more shocked. She called for a midwife and came to my bed and demanded to know the name of the man responsible for putting me in such dishonor. The old lady of the house called for Beauplaisir, and when he arrived, he denied having any relations with me other than admiring me from afar. I was so inflamed by his denial that I went into labor. I went in the next room and delivered my healthy baby girl. And when they returned to the room, I relayed the whole truth. They stood in profound reverie until at length my mother apologized to Beauplaisir for any trouble she'd given him. She told him she originally wanted to oblige him to marry me, but upon hearing the extent of my story, that the fault was wholly mine. He left and was confused and full of cogitations. He returned several times to visit me and check on my health, but my mother urged him to refrain. And thus ends an intrigue which is full of variety as any, perhaps, that many ages were produced.